Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jason Q. I'm Managing Attorney for the Nonprofit and Small Business Legal Assistance Programs at the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. We are very excited today to have Mike Gelman, a CPA and experienced fiscal and financial strategy expert, with us to talk about how nonprofits should be evolving their fiscal outlook and practices in light of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. I'd also like to thank Lauren Paley, our program specialist at the Pro Bono Center, for helping us set up today's event. So some quick logistical points before we begin. You can download a copy of the slides for today's presentation under the Handouts tab on GoToWebinar. Mike will also be previewing some additional tools and resources, which we'll send out after the presentation. GoToWebinar also has a questions field that you can use to type in questions during the presentation. Mike has a lot of materials to get through today, so we might not be able to take all the questions that come in, but please do go ahead and ask. Okay, and without any further ado, I'd like to pass the microphone over to our presenter, Mike Gelman.
Thank you, Jason. So looking forward to today's presentation. Just by way of introduction, I'm Mike Gelman. I'm from the Washington, D.C. area, and I am a CPA. I've spent most of my career in public accounting and left public accounting about 3 years ago and started a consulting group called Fiscal Strategies for Nonprofits here. We work with nonprofit organizations of different types and NGOs outside the U.S., working on sustainability, fiscal and financial communications, effective financial communications, and strategy and continuity. And of course, very active during this time around this subject with the COVID-19 crisis, which will be a basis for what we're talking about here today. I spend about a third of my time working directly with C-suites and board members on these topics today. And then I also spend almost half of my time doing classes like this. My home base for teaching is out of Georgetown University, where I teach out of a couple different, the Public Policy School, the McDonough Business School, and a couple other areas. And I teach in the CAE program at ASAE, the IOM for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Institute of Organization Management, and for a lot of national organizations of different types, and for federal and state agencies. I really enjoy doing this. Before I move on, because the content is a little heavy today, and I'm going to go through the learning objectives here in a moment, my contact information is my email is mgelman@fiscalstrategies for nonprofits. And we just launched a website at the end of March, se4nonprofits.com, that has a lot of information that we're posting every week related to the COVID-19 crisis and financial, legal, and fiscal areas. And so I encourage you to go there, and some of the resources we're talking about here today you can find there. Okay, so with that, let's go through the learning objectives for today. We're going to do the first part. We're going to talk about, during a period of uncertainty, how we go about making decision making. You'll see this is a little bit different approach. There is a worksheet, framework worksheet that goes with this that we'll be doing and going through. And so we'll be jumping into part one first. In part two, we're going to meld up the framework with a methodology, what I like to call rolling 3-month budgets. Talk about why that strategy works now, how we compare that strategy to an annual budget process, and of course the messaging. Both of these are a form of dashboards that we'll be talking about here today, and both are built for you to use. Of course, there's no one spreadsheet that works for everybody, and I'm going to talk about ways to format that and to help make it personal to your organization. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get into part one. As Jason said, I would encourage questions as we go through. The content's a little bit on the heavy side, but I would like to take questions as we go along. And we'll save a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. So we're going to be talking about hyper change period right now. This is really crazy. I was just thinking every morning when I wake up, it's like, is this a nightmare? I wish it was over. But depending on how you want to look at this, we're 3 months in, or we're into the 4th month. And like other crises, each one is different. I feel like this one is really unpredictable. Each crisis, of course, does have a different feel. We still don't know where the light at the end of the tunnel is. We're dealing with 2 variables that are both unpredictable of their own. One of them extremely unpredictable, the medical side of it. And I hope we pray we get our arms around that. The economic fallout from this thing, a little more understandable, but I think that's going to be here for a while. I'm going to refer back to 9/11, which happened, of course, in September, and the 2008-2009 banking crisis, and how they compare and contrast to this, and a couple of uniform observations. So what I'm trying to get at here is two things. I think what we should do is, since there's so much uncertainty, so much disruption, and we're not quite sure what even the near future looks like, that based on this framework, we have to really concentrate on our communications, and that we're going to overlean on all the decisions that we're having to make on the fly through a financial lens. Now, I know I'm a CPA and I'm biased that way, and I'll show you why, but I think it'll give a sense of calmness and a sense of thoughtfulness. Okay, I have financial professionals on here, but really this is geared around senior management, and which includes the board, because we're in this together making these decisions. Okay, so here's the components of it. We're going to look at how we can react and continue to react to all the changes that are going around us. We're going to do an assessment of organizations, whether in financially in a healthy position or financially they're in a weaker position. We're going to look at two variables that are changing before our eyes. The first one hit really quick, which was in the upfront, the vulnerability of funding resources and whether they were immediate or expected down the road. And then a separate volatility factor around demand, where services have increased and decreased. We saw events being canceled. We saw demand for services skyrocketing, demand for some other services disappearing. Okay. We're going to cycle back on this financially strong with this weak position, and we're going to talk about operating reserves here and how that will be displayed on the spreadsheet. Okay, and then we're going to save the last part of this section to go through the spreadsheet, because I always believe in the 80-20 rule. A lot of times it's 20% problem solving and 80% messaging, and I think this tool really helps. This came out of scenarios that I started using early on. And I'm gonna come back to that and talk about that here in a couple minutes. We'll break this down into 4 parts. We're going to get right into part 1 in a minute, which is the starting point. Then we're going to go through those 3 critical factors of financial health, vulnerability of funding sources, demand for services. Talk about timing and implementation, which is critical. We can't do the normal nonprofit, just hesitate and defer. We have to move decisions pretty quickly now. Discussion on operating reserves, and then we'll go through the framework. Okay, for a starting point, this is a crazy time period right now. I was on Georgetown University's campus teaching the week of March 8th through the 12th. That from that Monday through that Thursday, it just seemed the world pivoted completely. The first week of March, there was no shelter in place. We were sort of guessing everything seemed to be okay, talking with groups who were on site. The class I was teaching at the McDonough Business School there was nonprofit CEOs coming in from around the country for a leadership 4-day conference. Not conference, it's a set of classes that Georgetown sponsors. And by the time we got to Thursday, everything had changed. I will remember March 11th, like September 11th. I was teaching a class that morning. Everybody started fidgeting in the class. Everybody had gotten a blast email, and we were on campus and said, the school campus was closing. And it's just literally how everything pivoted, and working with the different organizations in the room. It was an amazing time. So during this uncertainty, we're going to fall back on this position that I think helps us to have a course going forward, which is protecting financial position the #1 priority. Before I go on to the next slide, I want to say this, and this is my opinion. I believe, short of running someone over with a truck, that nonprofits are most at risk right now of taking a deep financial hit to their balance sheet, their financial position, their ability to be around, survive, not be a shell of what they were. This is happening really fast. And I think so. This is our #1 priority to protect, is our financial position. And the reason is because of these 3 factors right here. We still can't, in the 4th month of this thing, more than 90 days into this thing already, we still can't figure out the timing and pace of change. It's unpredictable. Today is Tuesday, right? I don't know where we're going to be on Friday, let alone where we're going to be a month or two from now. And we're no better at guessing this than we were back in end of March, end of April, end of May. And we're now at the middle of June. The scope of the change still fooling us on what is, all the different elements of this is coming in. I believe the medical side of this will eventually get our arms around and such. I think the economic side of this is, I gotta believe it's that 3 to 5 year window right now. I mean, if you just look at different some forecasts, like the airline industry is saying 5 years to recover, hotels saying 3 to 4 years. It's really crazy. And the impact of change, we're still figuring it out because we're not a full year into it. Whether you're a June 30 year end or a 12/31 year end, lots of different impacts. Whether your revenue cycles, your main events, your activities, your grants, are they front end loaded, back end loaded, how it's going to affect these and such. So with that said, I'm going to break a rule. I'm going to read something from my slide because it's extremely important. We have to adopt a conservative approach and favor overweight. So I'm up front. I communicate this right up front to people, and I think it helps in the decision-making process that we have to favor overweight the impact of management decisions have on protecting financial assets. And what do I mean about this? I'm just going to get right out there. I get this question a lot. When it comes to mission and financial health, right now we got to protect financial health over mission. Over the long haul, we protect mission, okay? But if we get so hurt and so damaged and so weakened right now that our ability to do mission in the future disappears, we will help a lot less people. We will not be able to do what we were set up for. So at the risk of maybe doing a little less mission now, we got to protect our mission going forward, okay? So that's the first part of this thing, is that we're going to take a financial, we're going to overweight all our decisions to protect financial position. Okay, let's go through the 3 critical factors. These, you will see these through the framework template that will be popping open here in a little bit. There's 3 parts to it. The orders of these, I really feel good about. I think they need to be looked at in this order. It helps in both the messaging and then the problem solving. We're going to first go through a financial health assessment, okay? We have to know whether our organization that you're looking at is either in a strong position or a weak position, because the tactics and things that you need to do are totally different for those 2 types of organizations. Right behind that, once we do this assessment of strong versus weak, is we're going to go and look at the vulnerability of our funding sources. And this is both immediate and down the road, okay? And we're going to do an assessment on that. I really like this part. You'll see it, the visual aid on this. And third, we're going to do a separate assessment on the demand capacity for our services. Capacity can be related to grants, demand can be related to programs and events and registrations and things that are going on. And they can be going up and down, as we will see with a lot of organizations. I had a group in the room that was a Easter Seals group out of the Midwest. Started out the beginning of the week, felt really good. They were coming off 3 great years. The support from the general public was great. By the end of the week, she felt, and it was a little bit of an exaggeration, I talked to her a few, but her first words out of her mouth, she thought she had lost 90% of her funding by the end of the week. And it wasn't that bad, but they were still down 60% of their funding. Over a couple months later, they were in jeopardy. Meanwhile, the demand for their community-based services was skyrocketing. So funding was falling, demand was going up. It was a crazy time. So for step 1, we got to do a health assessment through the framework to see whether we're in a strong position or in a weak position, okay? Couple of statements here. Statement number 1, I always say this in all my classes, I don't care what I'm talking about. And the statement is this: the health of an organization only shows up on the balance sheet. Yet we get tunnel vision as human beings on the budget, the income statement. It's constantly watching budget performance, how we're doing budget year, and great. But you could be having a great budget year. Revenues are having best budget year you had in a long time. And we've come off a 2-3 year period of great strength generally in the economy. And your balance sheet could be underwater. You could have a very tight cash position because the things really went south years ago, or you had to do a lot of capital investment in your building or something. Okay, you have your balance sheet, you take one look at it and you can tell whether it's strong or weak, okay? So even though a budget year is strong, the balance sheet could be in a very weak and even underwater situation. Now I'm going to take a leap of faith, and I have some people disagree with me on this, and it's not fair, but if I had to rely on one single factor on a balance sheet to tell me if it's in a strong or weak position, the factor I'm going to rely on is operating reserves. I believe that's the best indicator. Now you got to look at the balance sheet in totality, but to me, having an operating reserve policy, understanding where you are related to that policy is extremely important. Okay. Jason, I just want to check how we're doing. We're about 15 minutes in. Any questions so far? I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about operating reserve policies here for a minute.
Nope, not yet. We're good to go.
Okay, thank you so much. Really important. What do I mean by formal versus informal? Don't get worried about this. You either have an operating reserve policy or you don't. If you don't have one, you should informally sort of adopt an operating reserve goal. And this is have your goal in mind. What is an operating reserve policy? And quick overview, and I spend 1 to 2 hour webinars just on operating reserve policies. But operating reserves, you have assets minus liabilities equal net assets on a balance sheet. We'll see this towards the end. And in those net assets, what would be left over if the doors were closed? You have both restricted and unrestricted funds, funds with donor restrictions and funds without donor restrictions. Operating reserves only sit inside the unrestricted portion of those net assets without donor restrictions. And yet it's not the total part of that. It's only the liquid part of those unrestricted net assets. Okay, and the big thing that we usually have to take out is fixed assets. And it's extremely important, especially the organizations that have property, buildings, office headquarters of some type that they own. Okay, and that can tie up a lot of unrestricted net assets and a hard asset that we can't liquidate. Okay, informal, what do I mean by this? If you don't have an operating reserve policy, about 10 years ago, there was a study done, the National Operating Reserve Initiative. There were over 100 volunteers on that project, lots of different organizations. It was co-sponsored by the United Way International and the Urban Institute. I was one of the people working on it. I was one of the lead presenters. I went around the country talking on it. We never just came up with what is a perfect operating reserve goal. Impossible. We had so many different types of organizations participating, a lot of universities and not too many small groups. But we did come up with one statement, and you got to write this down, really important. I lean on it every day. And the statement is this, that organizations that have less than, got it? Less than 3 months of operating reserves, 25%, 1/4 of their budget put away, liquid, are in a weakened position. That's the only statement we came out of almost 4 years worth of work that we could all agree on. So I flipped that around. Remember what I just said, organizations have less than 3 months, 1/4 of their budget put away as an operating reserve is in a weakened position. So the way, and we're going to come back to this, I like to think of operating reserves is that organizations have 3 months or more are starting to get into that good area. Now, there is no perfect operating reserve. I will say for 501c3 publicly supported groups, the operating reserve goal tends to be 3 to 6 months, with 6 months the typical goal, half of a budget cycle. C6, C7, C4s tend to go up towards 12 months, but whatever. But if you don't have one, we want to be north of 3 months. And if you're under that, you're in a weakened position, and you'll see why that's important later. Because two things, no operating reserve can protect you from a long-term change. This crisis is a long-term change. Medically, don't know how long it's going to be here. Economically, 3 to 5 years. Okay. And so if that's the case, we should be pulling very little out of operating reserves right now. But by default, things change quickly. We start to deficit spend, and we are pulling money out of operating reserves, and we got to wean ourselves off of that. There's an article on the website called Using Operating Reserves, and there's a concept in there, metering out. I'm going to come up on that in a few more minutes, a little more detail. Okay, so healthy or strong, healthy or weak, strong or weak, that comes off the balance sheet. Part 2 is looking at the vulnerability of our funding sources. I like this. I came up with this early. I've used this a gazillion times already over the last 4 months. I really like this. And here's the way I look at it. I have organizations that have broken this into 4 parts. I like to break it into 3. I like the messaging. I don't like this at 2. And you can't stand up in front of a board and say, wow, we're reacting, but it looks like we're going to take a 20% hit in our funding. That says you're total wild ass guessing. You don't know. What is more important to do for yourself and for your board is to sit there and break your funding down into these 3 categories, maybe 4. I like these 3, and you can change the wording. I was doing an engineering society and they hated the word shaky, so we replaced that. And we can sometimes adjust these parameters, 80 to 100, 50 to 80, 0 to 50. And I just start in a big picture way slotting our key funding sources into one of these 3 buckets. And a funding source could go into all 3 buckets. A good example of that is grants. You might have some grants that are coming from the federal, state, or local level that are rock solid, they're committed to, and they might even be increasing. For example, federal money coming through the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, okay, was a new funding. Our federal grants are good. Meanwhile, we could have a grant that's from a family foundation and they're just getting killed by this crisis. The market had dropped at one point and all that, and they just pulled back and said, hey, you know what, we're stopping our grants this year. And you could have in the middle. You could have donations, contributions that could be in 3 buckets. It could be that your individual giving we're guessing at right now. I want to talk a little more about that in a few minutes. But our corporate giving, because a lot of it was around sponsorships and the events are being canceled or going virtual, we're highly susceptible. Our foundations are there for us. So it's just a way, registrations on events and such. So I really like to break things down. I don't get too granular here, but I like these 3 buckets, okay? Jason, any comments here? These 3 buckets have really worked well. We're good?
No, we're good.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the 3rd metric, which is demand sensitivity. Okay, and here we look at, again, changes, but not by dollars, but in order of magnitude of the activity. So if it's an event, the number of people coming to it, is the event being canceled? Is it being rescheduled? Is it being redesigned as a virtual event or something? We have fee for services. Are we enabled to, in this environment, able to continue our services now? Or we can't do it during a shelter in place. But as we start to reopen, we already could be able to bring services back online, but they're coming back in stages and so forth, programs and such. Lots of interesting things here. Organizations that got PPP funds, we were asking grants for no-cost extensions because you can't double dip on the PPP funds. And if payroll was being covered, staff salaries were being covered by grants, restricted grants, then the PPP funds wouldn't be eligible for forgiveness under those. So what we would do is we'd try to work with the grant source to see if we could change the timing so we could use PPP funds now and then move forward. But this is all changing. As we know, the original PPP program came out with an 8-week period. And then on June 5th, it got just about 10 days ago, the new rules and the guidelines are just coming out the last few days. Now we have a 4-week period. And so forth, and then the forgiveness one, we had to do 75% related to payroll. Now it come down to 60, and then there was a cliff, and now the cliff has gone away. So there's so many things that are changing. So we got to keep looking at this. This number 2 down here, I use maybe half of the time. I like it as a messaging tool. A bunch of groups I've actually worked with, and we've done it, they're not using it. But this concept of controllable and uncontrollable. If an event was scheduled for, in the middle of May, and there was a shelter in place, and that event was canceled, or was on a university campus that was closed, or whatever, that's something we didn't make the decision. The event had to be, either canceled or moved or rescheduled or something. A controllable is we're seeing like, hey, this is the time of year to renew membership. What are we going to do to make people feel comfortable about renewing our memberships? So I like to take all the decisions that we're looking at in the events here and say, some of the things we didn't control. We had to do this. We had to move it or do something. Some of the things we're being proactive, and this is what we're doing. I just like the optics of the messaging through these 2. Okay. So let's go to timing and implementation. One more new sort of thing I want you to think about. And it's this thing called short term versus super short term. And if you just think about, I call it the domino effect. If you think about any problem solving situation we're in right now, and you go from domino A to domino B to domino C, all of a sudden you get to an area and you say, I can't, there's no formula to this. There's so many unknowns that it's really hard to plan for anything. And the perfect example is all these groups that were having events this summer. Well, early on, we started throwing those out. And now most of the events scheduled all the way up to December are being rethought and such. So everything's changing around us. So this concept of super short and short is figuring out the decision making, the decisions we have to react to that are in front of us, and dividing this and separating out the super short term ones and just concentrating on those, because I think it gives a sense of purpose, a sense of action. We're doing things, a sense of calmness, which I really like the optics of that. And then as we work on these, it buys us time on the super short, it buys us time on the short term, which are queued up right behind it. And then, and then we're learning, we're reading, reacting, because things are changing on the ground a lot. So here's how the super short versus short term look. Sorry. Again, you should format this to work to your organization. Generally, the bigger the organization, mega size groups, we're taking super short term in 7 to 10 days, no more. I always cap the short term at 60 days. So if this was a large organization looking at through 10 days, our decision-making process, then this would go 10 to 60 days. And you'll see this on the spreadsheet, how we list these side by side. Believe it or not, the comfort comes from the peripheral vision to see these next to each other. Anybody's ever been on my classes or anything, I'm a big dashboard guy, which is getting all this information into one sheet of paper so people can look at it. And you'll see this on the dashboard when we get there on the framework. Okay. So really like this. I think because it gives us marching orders here, and we just feel good we're doing things, but it also, what I really like from an ERM, enterprise risk management perspective, we can read and react, see how these things are going, see how things are changing on the ground, and then position for the short term. Provides a sense of purpose during a time of craziness, a sense of calmness, that we're taking a thoughtful approach to changing situations around us. Okay, so let's go back to operating reserves, and I want to talk about this before we go through the framework. This is the last key area. It could be an oversimplification, but I think having looking and assessing financial health through operating reserves is the key. I believe it's as close to a universal benchmark of financial health versus financial weakness as we could come up with. I also like the optics of an operating reserve, which usually we can state in the number of months, just like we said with the NORI project, the National Operating Reserve Initiative, that under 3 months is considered in a weakened position. So obviously you want to be 3 months or north of. If you had an operating reserve policy, and let's take a very boring one that says you want to have a 6-month operating reserve, and you have 9.6 months or 10 months of operating reserve, you're north of your goal. But if you have a 6-month operating reserve goal and you're at -2 months, that's like a slap in the face. You can see one's weak, one's strong. And I love reporting financial information in non-dollar terms on a dashboard. In operating reserves, I like to do that in terms of number of months, number of grants, number of staff. There's a lot of different ways we can report it without saying the dollars. To walk up to someone on the street and say, just I'm picking a number. Let's say we have a $1.2 million budget, smaller organization. They have their operating reserve goal would be $600,000 on a 6-month. Okay. And to say we've got $200,000 in the bank might sound like a lot, but that's only 2 months of operating reserves. And if their reserve goal is 6 months, you would say 2 to 6 versus 200,000. Okay. And it can work for really large organizations where your operating reserve goal in actual dollars might be millions of dollars. But those millions of dollars might only be 4.2 months. Okay, and so we always report that way. So here we go. Organizations that have substantial operating reserves have a whole different set of options and tactics to consider than organizations that are underwater with little or no operating reserves. And underwater, we're going to talk about that here, to me is the scary thing. And that comes from 2 places. on your balance sheet, you can see millions of dollars on a nonprofit balance sheet, and it can be extremely unhealthy. There's two things working against nonprofits, especially 501c3s. They might have built up a lot of restricted net assets. So their unrestricted net assets without donor restrictions is actually negative, which means they're invading the restricted funds. The other big set I see a lot of times, organizations that have a lot of unrestricted net assets, but they're sitting on a lot of hard assets parked inside a building and equipment, vans and all that stuff, and you can't liquidate that. And their actual cash position is really tight. So operating reserves come out of unrestricted net assets, liquid unrestricted net assets. So it's basically unrestricted net assets minus fixed assets. And I said that a little bit quickly. So there's two things I always look at. I look to see, I don't care if there's millions of dollars on there. I look to see if there's a lot of restricted funds and if there's a lot of fixed assets. And then I look at operating reserves, unrestricted net assets. Two things. Organizations with operating reserves. Much rather be this than organizations down here without operating reserves. But organizations with operating reserves have a problem. They got to figure out how they're going to use those reserves during a time of craziness. And the key there is this metering out concept, meter out. If you go back to the SC4 nonprofit website, there's an article I posted on using operating reserves. I would highly encourage you to go through it. I do a 1-hour webinar on it, but it's a concept that no operating reserve will last forever to protect you against a permanent change. And what we're in is a longer term change. And to me, anything more than 6 months is long term. And if that's the case, technically, we should not be using operating reserves. But things are changing so rapidly that a lot of organizations by default are in deficit spending right now, at least on a quarter-over-quarter basis. And so they are using operating reserves, and they need to get to cost containment and get to alignment so we're not pulling too much out. Real quick example here. If your operating reserve goal was 6 months on the $1.2 million, which would have been $600,000, and let's say you were sitting there at $600,000, I would argue that you should not use any more than 10 to 15% of those operating reserves in the first rolling quarter, which is going to come to an end at the end of June on a natural quarter basis. And that for that next quarter, the July, August, and September, if you pull 15% out, you should cut that in half and not pull more than 7.5. And for the quarter after that, maybe get down to like 3% coming out of where operating reserves is supporting you. And so by the end of the calendar year, that you're weaned yourself off using operating reserves. And if you did that sort of method and you went to 15 plus 7 is 20 plus, you'll be about 25 to 30% down. You'd still have 70% left. I'd like to be able to help an organization pivot to have at least 60% of their operating reserves still intact by the end of the calendar year. Okay, fiscal years don't mean anything anymore. And there's an article I read on that right now. So everybody see that? Jason, any questions there? Good.
Yeah, we had someone with a kind of different, in a bit of a tighter situation. They were asking, they're a smaller organization, they have strong operating reserves, about 6 months, but they were operating before on a lot of earned income, and it was like over 80% was earned income, and that's all evaporated. They're not able to transition that online, so they're going to have to use these reserves to maintain the small staff that they have. And their question was, if they're kind of hibernating, not making that income and just living off the reserves, what level of reserve should they still aim to have on hand in the near future? And how do they make that kind of decision?
Okay, and that's really aligned with they might ask that question right before I gave that example. For some reason, I love to have at least 60%, no more than 50% left over. Remember, especially the ones that are living on earned income exchange transactions, those are going to be slow to come back. They got to find the new normal, what they can balance to, and they got to wean themselves off operating reserves pretty quick, or their 6 months is going to disappear in 6 to 8 weeks, or you know what I mean? It's going to disappear really quick. And what took 30 years to build up 6 months operating reserves, you can lose it in 30 weeks. So you got to get to this and such. Pivoting down, groups without operating reserves, they got to go to cost containment, because all they're going to do, otherwise their cash position is going to get really tight super fast, and probably already tight coming into this. Okay, so repeat, organizations with operating reserves in a good position, but the most difficult, because they got to figure out how to stay. And that example, Jason, you just gave is a perfect example. They have 6 months, but they're a smaller group. And if they keep that staff in place, sure, they can keep them in place and then it'll all be gone. And if their new normal is, 25% of the revenue that they were getting in before, they need to downsize to that. My argument is get there sooner, and then we protect some of those reserves and have at least 60% of it for the future. Organizations that have no operating reserves, they got to move quickly, or their poor position is going to get poorer really fast, and they could be sustainability and survivability could be affected. Okay, so we're going to do the framework now. I just want to lay it out. The framework's in 3 pieces: a step 1 financial health, a step 2 operating reserves in the middle, and a step 3 the health decisions super short that we're going to do. This top is broken into 3 categories: assessing balance sheet, financial health, looking at the vulnerability of funding sources, and then demand. And that goes from left to right across the top of the page. The middle is the operating reserve position. I'll show you that. And then the bottom is the short and super short. So I'm going to go ahead and pivot to this. Jason, can you just confirm with me that you can see the spreadsheet?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, let me just show you real quick.
If you can, Mike, it might make sense to actually zoom it out a little, zoom in a little bit, just to make it a little easier to read with that plus button.
Yes, I will do that. Actually, I'm going to go the opposite way first. I want you to see that it is a dashboard that has everything on it. I do this just to freak Jason out, okay? And then you'll see the 3 sections, middle and top. Okay, we're going to go through this now. We're going to concentrate on the top section, but you'll see step 1 is the financial health assessment. Step 2 is in the middle, and step 3 is on the bottom. Let's go through step 1 at the top. I do want to show you this. I do love the word framework. Framework just says to me, and I've used that word, I haven't found a better word, that during a time of crazy changes, disruption, unpredictability, that we have a thoughtful process to keep evaluating that and come up with a plan of action, and that we will update this framework from time to time. So it really shows that we were thoughtful during a time where it's hard to be thoughtful. The financial health goes here, and this is just me. When financial statements are strong, there's a lot to list up here. Good cash position, no debt, accounts payable low, a lot of unrestricted net assets. When you're weak, there's nothing up here and a lot of stuff down here. No cash, high accounts payable, debt, sitting on a lot of restricted funds, maybe buildings, okay? And I like this down here. If our goal is 6 months and we have negative 2 months operating reserves, forget this last line for a minute right now, all of a sudden that's like a slap in the face, we're in trouble. But if our goal is 6 months and we're sitting on 18 months, we're in good shape, okay? And I just like that, and you can see it. Here's my 3 buckets: rock solid, vulnerable, and shaky. And remember, I talked to you about how you could have grants up here, here, and here. You could have PPP funds, but remember, they're one-offs. Hopefully we'll work on forgiveness and timing and such. So I really like putting this in here. Contributions could be in all 3 buckets, and why. We did see organizations saw an immediate pullback in individual giving, but there was a rebound in late April and May. And so we're, at the beginning, we were starting to project contributions could be really crap for the rest of the year, and maybe not, and such, but there's a lot of economic factors in front of us. And then here's the demand volatility we can list. This could be more or less than 5. I'd like to list it our 5 biggest things. Remember, this is not by dollars, this is by capacity, activity, and and like percentage of your efforts. And then here's my controllable, uncontrollable. If you'd like to use this, a bunch of groups don't, so we just blank this section out and make this bigger. But I like the optics of messaging that this is what we did with the uncontrollable ones. We had to cancel the XYZ. This is what we did with the controllable things. Okay. If you go down the page and you can see the other 2, they speak for themselves. Operating reserves are either weak or strong. I usually don't have this neutral, but I just want to put it in. And of course, if your operating reserve goal is 12 months, it would say over or under 12 months. Here, I usually have 7 or 8. It's just the spreadsheet right here. It's just format. I only had 4. These are our key points of reference, key changes, what we're doing with our key events, what we're doing with grants, different things, and which ones we're hitting right now, super short term, and which ones we're going to key up right after this. And then we sit this behind our regular financial dashboard, and we date it the same, and we go in natural quarters. Okay, So that's how that works. That's up on the website, and Jason will be sending it to you. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. We have about 20 minutes left, and we got to get to the second part. So let me just do that. So now we're going to go through the rolling 3-month budget concepts. This will go a little bit faster, and I have one more template to show you that goes with this, and that also will be sent to you, and it's up on the website. Okay, here we go. Both strong and weak nonprofits must pivot to rolling 90-day or 3-month budgets until true recovery begins. And I think there's a step before true recovery. It's called pre-recovery, because I still think we're in the OMG, the oh my God phase right now. We're still trying to figure out what the hell's going on. And because of waves and spikes and things and such, I think it's still very unpredictable right now. And we have other things that are adding to this unpredictableness. We have racial unrest that's going on right now. We have hurricane season coming up. We have an election cycle coming up. We have so many things that are going on. It is impossible to predict where we're going to be. And because of that, I think you can't have rolling 1-week budgets. I think 3 months is the ideal to make a commitment for 3 months, read and react, and go to the next 3 months. Okay. And I like this. So it gives you a chance to, over that 3-month period of time, to look at your sources of funding during that time. Look at the controllable, uncontrollable, remember the framework worksheet. But now we pivot to the bottom line. Notice on the framework, there was no bottom line. I was just trying to look at the variables. And on this next frame worksheet, you'll see at the bottom line, the deficits. I'm assuming everybody in this first natural quarter is hitting bottom line losses, but not everybody. We'll see. And then how that affects our financial position. So step 1 would be to do the worksheet we just went through, and to go through, and you're just, without looking at the bottom line, you're making that assessment, how it's going to impact our financial health. Are we strong or weak, and how much we can put at play, our operating reserves, how capacity is changing and funding. Okay, we already walked through the framework worksheet. So now let's talk about worksheet number 2, the 3-month rolling budgets. A couple of things. I really like the concept of going to natural quarters. Your fiscal year end doesn't mean anything anymore, but we're all coming up on one of the big ones, which is June 30. We're talking about natural quarters, of course, April through June, July, September, and we're going to do natural quarters. Okay, do that for 2 reasons. One, it sort of lines up. This thing hit hard in the middle of March, so we're planning April, May, June. What it means at June 30 year ends, they had 8.5 months, probably doing really well, followed by 3.5 months of craziness. Whether those two meld together, and there's an article on the, there's a blog on this on the website, means nothing. I had an organization that sold a building in November, was sitting on a really strong June 30, great results, tanking so bad with most of their earned income and other sources and grants disappearing, that they're, at least we'll break even. No, you sold a building that was a 30-year asset, took a ton of money, and you wiped it out in 3.5 months. So what I'm arguing here is that you need to report on a quarter basis and look at it separately. Yes, 990s will be out there. Yes, year-end audits will be out there, but to meld out 8.5 months and 3.5 months means nothing. You need to look at them separately. But as we look forward, we need to do this best case, worst case, likely case example. And I just want to talk about this for a few minutes before I show you the spreadsheet. Okay, and what I mean by this is there's 2 strategies, on this. It depends on the organization. I go both ways. In a 3-column, everybody's heard of best case, worst case, likely case scenario. You can build this 2 ways. For smaller to mid-sized organizations, I build the likely case. And then for a few material, larger funding source revenue lines, I will go and do my up-down, best case, worst case on either side. I'll keep a bunch of the other lines the same, a few expenses, maybe around staffing. And you'll see this on the spreadsheet. For mid to small, large size organizations, I build the best case and the worst case independent. And then the likely case is not halfway in between them. Should never be, because in the metrics, you're saying for this revenue source, remember the spreadsheet we did on the framework, the shaky, vulnerable or rock solid. that our memberships are rock solid because of the way we have all indications that 90% of our members are going to renew, but we're thinking the new members, the new members we acquire might be shaky. And so for renewing memberships, we might be close to the best case, but for new memberships, we might be closer to the worst case and so forth. And you explain that. It should never be halfway because then you're just guessing. So the best case, worst case become outliers, and then you talk about individual where those pieces will be. And so I really like in the key assumptions, you'll see this on the spreadsheet, how we explain this. Okay. And you'll see this built into the spreadsheet, and I want to take more than a few minutes to walk this through. That we'll be able to document on the likely case why we went closer to best case for memberships, but closer to worst case for individual giving. Closer to best case for grants, because most of our grants are committed. We've talked to each of the grant sources. No problem. We feel really good about putting some of our grants at 100%. Okay. But for corporate sponsorships, we're not sure. And maybe that's going to be sort of in the middle. And we're going to do that. And the same thing goes for the programs, the capacity. Are we going to take an in-person event and do it virtual, or what? Or do we delay the event so we can go back in and skip a year? All these different things. And we have to take a strong look at how our capacity is going to be affected. PPP funds are a big help if you were able to get them as a C3. Non-C3s couldn't get it, but they're not permanent. Okay. So we have to look over these things. Really important. Okay. So Jason, we're going to go ahead and walk through the spreadsheet now. So give me 1 second. And I'm not apologizing, but as a Jason, do you have it up on the screen?
Yep, we can see it.
Yeah, and I know it's real small. I'm going to make it bigger in a minute. Okay. I do just want people to see that it's a one-pager. There's 3 key sections. The top is, we're going to go through these. We got the top, we got a balance sheet over here, and we got our key assumptions here with some messaging pieces on the side. I'm really big into dashboards. I love it. The thing that goes through my mind on these type of dashboards, and this will be close to our full financial dashboard, is, think of an NFL coach. They spend months and months and months getting ready for the first game of the season. They have every piece of electronic equipment. They've been game playing out this everything, yet the coach still has his laminated sheet of paper that he uses to hide his face. That is his cheat sheet. And this becomes my cheat sheet for discussing things with people. Let me make this bigger because it's hard to see. Okay, so we're going to go through the sections of this, how it works, why I like certain parts of it and such. And again, this is available and will be sent to everybody. You can get it off the spread, and we have about 10 minutes. You can get it off the website. So let's take a look. We're in the April to June quarter now. This one here is built on a June 30 year end, just so you can know. But everybody, well, you have 12/31 year end, September year end, whatever you got. The gray area is just for benchmarking purposes only. How did we finish up our last fiscal year? Also notice that I went off a program perspective and into a straight line item perspective, because this planning is more like cash flows than they are budgets right now. Okay, but it could be on a programmatic basis, but I like to look at it this way. So if we were a $1.2 million organization, that would show up here. Okay, that's last year's actual. This year's current budget, let's say we were projecting the current budget to be at $1.5 million. And then if you can, in your budget, hopefully you have real-time monthly budgets, you can isolate the last quarter. Notice I don't have year-to-date activity in here at all because it's meaningless. All I want to get to is under the old normal. What was the last quarter of that June 30 fiscal year, or the second quarter, your 12/31 year, whatever it is? What was that quarter like? So when we do this best case, worst case analysis, we can compare to it. I will tell you though, in the same breath, we're never going back here again. Life's going to be different down the road. New normal is going to look different. Okay. And so smaller organizations, I tend to build this box out. And then just for a few lines, I'll go here and here. Larger, mid-sized, larger organizations, more complicated, I build this and this independent, and then we figure out we're going to be 80% of best case here, 20% of best case here, and so forth. And then that, I'll show you where we explain that. Let me just go to the bottom. Down here, this quarterly key assumptions is not for the balance sheet. We'll go through that in a minute. It's for this side over here, that when we did our best case, worst case up above, individual donations, best and worst, we broke it down, and we're going to be close to best case because we figure individual giving is going to bounce back, but corporate sponsorships are going to be closer to the worst case. And I don't go over this. I try to limit this to 6 or 7 key assumptions, not every little thing. Okay, obviously labor force will be in here. Labor could be because of the PPP funds, and we're reading, reacting. We might have been able to keep the workforce there, but we might be furloughing people in this quarter and such. We're moving out. Okay, back up to the top. When I finish this, the July to September stays blank right now. Okay, and what I mean is I'm thinking we would have done this a week or two ago. When we get to the middle of June, which we're at now, we would then go ahead and pull our July, September scenario. This box would move over here, and sitting out here would be October, November, December, and we'd leave that blank. Or you could keep the boxes marching. I haven't decided yet because we haven't gotten into this quarter yet, and I might keep them marching. It's just going to get them busy. A couple of things I want to point out, and then I want to throw it out there. Groups that have operating reserves, I put a box in the middle here that shows what, if these are deficits, I like to convert that to how much of the operating reserves we'll need to use to offset those deficits. Groups that don't have operating reserves, they use this worksheet straight up, and these deficits are just coming out of the balance sheet. Okay, I like to have a condensed balance sheet over here because you can see strong versus weak. Again, sticking with the quarter mode, March would have been the end of the last quarter. Coming up on June, that was the fiscal year end, you would adjust. So pretty soon, these are going to go June, June, June. If this is December 31st, it should be June, June, December 19. So whatever your fiscal year is, this is your fiscal year end. So we can quickly see, oh, sitting on a lot of cash, not much liabilities. Oh, I can see I got 12, 15 months of operating reserves because you can see in the change in net assets here. Okay, we got that. And then I showed you how the assumption section works. I have 2 messaging boxes, might want to get rid of one of them, but this is like overall senior management, executive director, CEO making comments. And this message box up here is more like controller, CFO making comments about individual lines and actual strategies being taken. And of course, you want that to meld up, this and these 2 boxes to meld up. So you can see it's a one-pager, a lot going on, but when you put this with the other framework, you start to see, a strategy, and you can see that, every 90 days we can pivot. I like to pull these together, and then, mid-June, pull this one out, mid-September, pull the next one, maybe a little bit. If the bigger you are, the sooner you might want to start game planning these out. Really large organizations, we ended up doing these quarters, not really looking at their fiscal year, but just did a rolling 4 quarters out. And we just expanded our assumptions, how we thought those were changing. We moved an event that's traditionally in September until 6 months later. So we moved it from September 20 to March 21. But if you have a 12/31 year end, it's moving it 2 over fiscal years. And and sort of we can sort of capture that to the balance sheet and the effect and such, and the impact on operating reserves. One last comment, groups that have operating reserves have a bigger balance sheet. I'm putting a box in here on operating reserves and our expected impact on them. Groups that don't have operating reserves, I use a worksheet very similar to this. Obviously, you could see ways to make this more or less in areas and such. Okay, Jason, any feedback? I know we went through that a bit quick, but there's a lot of content. Any
Yeah,
questions?
actually, this makes me think about one of the pre-submitted questions, and I think it speaks to this topic, which was someone wanted to hear some guidance on how these budgetary decisions should be divided between the executive director and leadership versus the finance committee versus the full board. So with the example of this worksheet, how do we sort of divide up those responsibilities?
Good. Okay. If there's a board member sitting next to you, cover their ears, because here's the way it's going to happen. Two things. Number one, decisions are making really rapidly. By definition, rapid decisions need to be made at the staff, senior management level. But during this time period, we need to over communicate with boards to let them know that everything's okay. This is the decisions we're making, so they can see where you're going. So they can pat you on the back and say, oh, we can see you're thoughtful. We like the approach. Keep going. Here's a few comments. But if you have to cycle back to a finance committee, executive committee, or a board for every decision that you've got like 24 hours to make, can't be done. And so you need to over communicate. I'm going to repeat those words. Over communicate during this time until we start to get into a true recovery period where we can go back to traditional communication cycles. We want to let them know where we're going because we're making decisions really rapidly. That was a really good question. We're dealing with that all the time. Different for different organizations. We got to keep C&T, confidence and trust, super high. That as we're making rapid decisions, that they're going along, they can see it. But we're actually not asking for their approval for each one of these decisions. It would, if you were, that would be like taking your finance committee and your board and having them meet weekly. Now, there's Jason, there's an article up there on setting up a COVID-19 task force. Larger organizations, we had to do this. I was working with individuals who were helping the state of Maryland out with their COVID-19 task force. Okay. And that task force, which doesn't have any approval, is working alongside staff closely and almost is like an extension of staff. I would highly encourage you to read that article. Those task forces have been a godsend for the right organization, and they help sit between staff and your board. Okay, you can put past presidents on there. You can put really critical resources that you don't have on staff. And for small organizations, they actually become like a pseudo workforce for you. But those task forces are sunsetted. They're just there to help get through a difficult time period. Do you have another question, Jason?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more, and this is an interesting one. Someone's asking, what about organizations whose missions are connected directly to addressing one or more of the current crises? So their mission is very, very relevant, very important right now. How do they navigate what to prioritize? And I think this circles back to a point I've heard you talk about before about balancing mission versus financials and other priorities during this period.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the most difficult decision we have to make, but I will tell you it is a clear path. If you're an organization that's been living hand to mouth, small organization, every time you get to a Friday pay period and you got enough money in the bank account, you go, thank God. You can't deliver more mission while your funding is being cut right now because you will disappear. Okay. And then large organizations that have spent 20 or 30 years building up a nice operating reserve, and they're going to use some of it now, but they can't blow through all of it. Okay. They've got to protect the organization. The one way to deliver on more mission is to be around a long time. And if you take steps now that are going to affect your ability to be around for a long time, you will do no mission. So simply put, if you do a little more mission now, you could disappear or wreck an organization that was financially strong, and it will be a smaller, much smaller organization. Or you might have to pull back a little bit right now so you can go back to being strong, viable organization in the future. And that's the thing we got to do. We got to be really careful. The comment came up before, and I know I'm repeating myself, but it's almost a sin right now to take more money out of operating reserves to keep the staff there, to keep delivering for another 2 or 3 months. If that's going to cause us to disappear, because then the PPP funds will disappear. We have a wave or spike in September, October, November. We have to pull back again. We're gone. Now, let's say we screwed up and everything got better quickly. Well, then we'll just ramp up the programs again. Yes, we could have helped a few more people earlier, but we'll get back there. But we have to err on that side. We have to err on the side of protecting financial position right now because we need to be around. So, Jason, I got us at 1 o'clock. Any other questions?
Yeah, No, I think
So,
that's all we'll cover today, but thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And we're a legal services organization. We don't always touch on the financial side of nonprofits as much as we'd like, but I think you've really emphasized how urgent and how many factors there are to think about at a management and at a board level. And that loops back to the kind of the fiduciary responsibility that board members certainly and officers have to their nonprofits to make these decisions and to weigh these factors right now. So thank you so much for giving us a lot of food for thought, and a lot of great perspective.
this statement at the end, this conclusion, I would use this right with yourself and your board, okay? And please go back to the Sustainability Education for Nonprofits site. The link is right here on the front. Jason, you're going to be sending over the worksheets to people, and they also can download
Yes.
them off this SC4 Nonprofits website. Send me an email. I'm happy to try to connect up and talk through. I learned from you. Each situation's got a new wrinkle to it, and it's my way to try to help out. I'm trying to spend as much time I can with groups. Thank you so much.
Great. Yeah. And I will say the website, the resources, the blog posts, the articles you have on there are tremendous. So I would encourage people to check all that out. All right. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you for joining us today.